I want to start by thanking Suzanne for that very generous introduction, and I want to thank the Becker Friedman Institute, Lars Hansen in particular, for inviting me here today, and to thank all of you for coming on a rainy night to hear me speak. I have to start with a bit of a disclosure, and that is that I'm not a healthcare economist or a biomedical expert, so the topic that I'm going to talk about is a little bit unusual for me. Typically when I give a talk, I'm the one who knows the most about the subject in the room. That's why people invite me to give talks. But for the last few years now, I have to say that's not been the case, because I've gotten interested for personal reasons in healthcare issues. And so I've been trying to think about various different aspects of healthcare from a financial perspective, and that's really what I'm going to try to talk with you about tonight. Now, it's a particular pleasure for me to do that at the Becker Friedman Institute, because for an economist, it doesn't really get much better than this. I've never had the privilege of meeting Professor Friedman, but I did get to meet Professor Becker a couple of years ago, and of course have interacted with Lars Hansen. And for an economist to be interacting with other economists of that caliber really is an unusual privilege, particularly because I think in this field of healthcare, economics actually can play a really important role. And it's a very different role that it's played in other fields. By way of background, I'm a financial economist. And so financial economists, I think, are slightly above child rapists now, given the financial crisis. And even when I was in grad school, I remember that there were all sorts of skepticism about economics. I remember when I was a first-year student at a cocktail party, hearing jokes from some of the upper-class economics students about our own field. Things like, you know, if you took all the economists in the world and you laid them end to end, they'd never reach a conclusion. Or the fact that Harry Truman, when he was looking for an economic advisor, asked for a one-armed advisor. And when asked why, he said, well, this way the economist can't say on the one hand, but on the other hand. And the one that really I found strange was the old joke about these an economist, a physicist, and an engineer on a deserted island with a whole case of tuna fish in cans, but no can opener. And they each came up with ideas for how to open it. And of course, the economist's idea was, assume you have a can opener. And it wasn't until I got to my second year of graduate school that I realized these weren't jokes. These are all true. And so it's frustrating because economics has a lot to offer, but there's a great deal of skepticism. And so I want to give you some examples of why using economics in very specific ways in healthcare could actually lead to some really transformative results. And I want to start with a little bit of a review of what's been going on in healthcare. And again, this is more from a personal perspective than anything else. My first exposure to these issues was back in 2000 when my next door neighbor developed melanoma. At first I thought that was just, a case of warts or pimples, skin cancer. How serious could that be? And I suspect those of you who know more about it than I did back then, you realize that it's quite serious indeed. He died 6 months after diagnosis at the ripe old age of 44. And so I was really shocked by that event. Shortly thereafter, one of my childhood friends died of breast cancer. She was 45, she died. And over the course of the ensuing years, more and more people that I knew had to deal with this. And so I started learning more about the disease and the various different ways of developing therapies for it. And in that process, a very strange contradiction emerged that I'm still trying to reconcile, and maybe some of you can help me think that through. So the contradiction begins with the fact that over the course of the last decade, there's been tremendous progress made in dealing with these amazingly challenging diseases. So an example is this individual, who I think most of you know, former President Jimmy Carter. Last year, President Carter was diagnosed with melanoma, the same skin cancer that took my next door neighbor. And it was stage 4 melanoma, which means that it had spread, metastasized in various parts of his body. He had tumors in his liver and in his brain. And so starting in August 2015, he was treated for these tumors, radiation therapy, chemotherapy. And then they tried a rather new drug that had just been approved the previous year. It's a drug that was developed by Merck called Keytruda. That's the trade name. The actual chemical, I believe, is called, or the compound is pembrolizumab. And I don't know where they get any of these names. Neither of them sound particularly user-friendly to me. But whatever it was, it worked. And by worked, I don't just mean that it made him better. It actually cured him. Now, those of you who've dealt with cancer and talked to oncologists, you know that oncologists don't like to use the word cure. Because cancer, even if it's in remission, it can come back with a vengeance after a while. But over the course of the last few years, more and more oncologists are using the word cure. And in President Carter's case, his body was free of tumor cells. He had tumors in his brain and his liver, and after taking this immunotherapy, where they used his own immune system and trained it to attack the tumor cells, after a few months, these tumors were gone. And they couldn't detect any more cancer cells in the entire body. And just last month, there was an announcement that President Carter made that his oncologist told him to stop coming back to see him. He stopped all treatments because he was cured. So this is extraordinary. But what's even more extraordinary is that this is not unique. These stories are happening all the time. Things that were death sentences just a few years ago are now not only chronic manageable conditions, but in some cases, we can cure them. So what's the conundrum? Well, the conundrum that I came across is that at the same time that we're making all these great breakthroughs, for whatever reason, funding for biomedical innovation has actually been going down, not up. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the biotech sector, you might think that that's a little bit counterintuitive. After all, the last few years, we've seen a number of very visible biotech IPOs and transactions, and you hear big drug companies making these mega billion-dollar deals. But it's really a very complicated landscape, and it has to do with the fact that there is a very big difference between the biotech sector and the pharmaceutical sector, and it really begins with the stock market behavior, at least for me, and how they have changed over the course of the last few decades. So let me make the argument from a financial perspective, which is my comfort zone. I want to argue that biomedicine is at an inflection point right now. We're at a very important point in the development of this industry. And to make that point, I'm going to show you two different indexes, stock market indexes. One is a pharmaceutical index, the big pharma companies, and the other are smaller biotech companies, separate index. And I'm going to show you the growth rate, or rather the cumulative growth of these two different sectors from 1994 to last year. So here's the pharma companies in green, and here are the biotech companies in red. A little bit of a difference, isn't there? Biotech has been on a tear. It's been growing rapidly, much more so than the pharmaceutical industry. Now, you can't really see the important differences over time in this particular scale, but if I show you the same graph on a logarithmic scale, where, because it's on a logarithmic scale, vertical distances amount to rates of return, what this shows is a very interesting narrative. Take a look at the green line. The green line seems to have three different regimes. In the mid-90s, the pharmaceutical company was earning a pretty reliable rate of return, and fairly positive. That's what the upward slope indicates. But for a period of about a decade, the pharma industry has managed to destroy shareholder value. For a 10-year period, the pharma index has actually gone down. It had a negative rate of return over 10 years, from the late 90s to the late 2000s. Biotech, on the other hand, has had a very different narrative. Lots of volatility, ups and downs, but starting around 2003, it seems to have been on a much steeper growth path. So here's a line that I've drawn on April the 14th, 2003. Does anybody know what happened on that day? Do you remember what you were doing on that day? Filing your tax returns, right? That's, apart from that, somebody else I think whispered it. Who? Nobody? On April the 14th, 2003, the US government announced that we had successfully completed sequencing the human genome. And almost like clockwork, from that day forward, the biotech industry takes off. Now, there are many other factors that explain this growth, but I don't think anybody who is knowledgeable of biotech will argue that the ability to sequence the human genome has had an indelible impact on biomedicine. A lot of the things that we do today, just as a matter of course, sequencing a woman's genes if she's diagnosed with breast cancer to know whether or not she's HER2 positive and able to respond to Herceptin, that wasn't possible prior to 2003. So all of these things are happening. We're at the verge of some major breakthroughs and incredible growth in this biotech sector. Why is funding declining? It just makes no sense. Now, we all know that public funding is declining for a variety of reasons that, while frustrating, at least we understand it's politics. But the private sector is also pulling back in some very strange ways. Now, the biotech IPO cycle seems to be declining. There was a period where it was doing really well, but those are companies that were started 7 to 10 years ago. So the biotech bubble may even have burst. But if you take a look at venture capital where they're investing in startups, the number of VCs in 2008 in the US for biotech is about 201. And as of a couple of years ago, that number's gone down to 138. So almost a third of the biotech VCs have shut down. And if you look at the really early stage Series A funding, first round financing for biotech startups, that's actually the lowest that it's been in about a decade. Why? Why, at the very cusp of being able to cure some of the most devastating diseases known to society, are we pulling back? And so here's where economics comes in. Now, to somebody with a hammer, I acknowledge that everything does kind of look like a nail. So as an economist, when I see funding going down, my first reaction is, well, there's probably an incentive. Probably it's because people are finding better opportunities elsewhere, and they don't like the risk-reward trade-off here, increasing risk and uncertainty. So I've been exploring that hypothesis. And the more I look, the more I'm convinced that this is really what's going on. That's why money is being pulled away at the very point at which we need it. And part of the reason is because the drug development process is incredibly challenging. It's a multi-phase, decade-long process where you start with lots and lots of different compounds and experimental therapies. And after various clinical trials, first in lab rats and then in people and of various different cohorts, after that long process, maybe, just maybe, you will have a drug. Latest estimates for what it costs to develop a single successful drug is $2.6 billion, spread out over 10 to 15 years. And you know what? It's getting more complicated, which is odd because we're getting so much smarter about biomedicine. And usually, I think that when you get smarter, things should get less risky and less difficult. That's not the way it works in biomedicine. As a finance person, the more you know about an investment, the less risky it is. In fact, if you know everything there is to know about the investment, like inside information, there's no risk at all. Shooting fish in a barrel. It's illegal, but very profitable. In biomedicine, the more we learn, it seems, the more difficult and risky things get. A good example is the AIDS cocktail. Many people have died from AIDS over the course of many decades. And at some point, we figured out that instead of treating patients with just one antiretroviral therapy, if you combine them into 4 or 5, they work like a charm. Well, now that we know that combination therapies work, we have an obligation, both moral and scientific and financial, to check to see whether or not combinations will work. Do you know how many combinations of existing drugs there are to go through, each of which requires its own separate and independent clinical trial that costs hundreds of millions of dollars, takes 10 years, and requires thousands of patients. So it's gotten harder. Now that we know that combination therapies are a possibility, it's gotten harder and more risky. And if there's one thing that we know about investors, it's that they do not like risk. I want to give you an illustration of this from a more personal perspective. I'm going to ask you to make a decision about risk versus reward. I'm going to show you the cumulative growth rates of 4 different financial investments. I'm not going to tell you what they are or even over what time period they span. I'm just going to show you what their cumulative growth looks like and ask you to pick one and only one to invest your entire retirement wealth in. All right? So these are the 4. Green line, red line, blue line, and black line. The green line doesn't have a lot of risk, doesn't offer much return. How many people would put their money in the green line? Okay, 1 person. All right, how about the red line? Better return, but more volatility, more ups and downs. How many people would pick the red line? Wow, all right, 2 or 3, okay, 4. All right, the blue line, much more volatility, but quite a bit more attractive. How many people would pick the blue line? Okay, so those are our hedge fund managers there. And finally, how many people would pick the black line? Wow, okay, the vast majority. Well, let me tell you what all of you picked. The green asset, first of all, the time period is from 1990 to 2008. And the green line is US Treasury bills, the safest asset in the world, but not very attractive from a return perspective. The red line is the S&P 500, the staple of most of our investments. Yes, exactly. So that's a smart investment, but it's got a bit of a roller coaster ride to it, right? The blue line is the single stock Pfizer drug company. Much more volatile, but more attractive. And what about the black line that most of you picked? Well, the black line is the rate of return from a fund called the Fairfield Century Fund. That's the feeder fund for the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. And so, in fact, that's why I ended up stopping it in 2008. Now you know how Madoff got so big. We are all drawn to low risk, high return. It's human nature. And so if I show you the black line, you are not going to want the blue line. And that's the problem. More and more now, drug development is looking like the blue line, and there are many other investments that look more attractive. Money's leaving the space. So here's the basic economics of developing a single anti-cancer compound. This is back of the envelope numbers that I came up with by reading the literature. It takes about $200 million just in out-of-pocket costs to develop a single compound from preclinical phases all the way through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 to new drug application and FDA approval. That's just the out-of-pocket cost for one compound. That's not what it costs to develop a successful compound, because you've got to try lots of different compounds before you hit pay dirt, and so that's where the number 2.6 billion comes from. The probability of a positive payoff in oncology is about 5%, and if you're successful, by the time you get FDA approval, you've got about 10 years left in the patent life of your drug. And that generates about $2 billion a year, which amortizes to a single payoff of about $12.3 billion in year 10. So here's the timeline. You put down $200 million on day 0. You wait 10 years, and you either get $12.3 billion or you get nothing. How many of you would want to put your retirement assets in this project? Yeah. All right, we've got a biomedical expert maybe that willing to bet on it. Right, exactly. So if it's your clinical trial, you might be willing to do that because you know something that we don't. But the typical investor, no thank you. In fact, when I propose this to my MBA students, I rarely get anybody who even asks me what the payoff is if you're successful. When they see that this is a 95% failure rate, their immediate response is, no thank you, I'm not interested. And for my quantitatively oriented students, they want to know what the mean and standard deviation of this investment is. It's got a mean rate of return of 12% and a standard deviation of 423.5%. Nobody is going to be interested in this from a simple mean variance perspective. That's the problem. That's why money is leaving the space. Well, financial engineering can help. Risk reduction is something that we know a bit about in finance. And so the typical financial response to a problem like this is simple. What if instead of investing in one of these, one at a time, what if we invested in 150 of these, all at the same time? Now, I know that sounds a bit crazy. If you don't want one, why would you want 150 of them? Well, first of all, in order to even do that, you need to have 150 times 200 million or $30 billion of capital. Where are you going to get that? And as an economist, I have a simple answer. Assume we have $30 billion. I'll come back to that in a minute and tell you why that assumption makes sense. But if we did have $30 billion, what would we do with it? Well, if we spread it out among 150 projects at the same time, and those projects are statistically uncorrelated, I'm going to come back to that assumption shortly. If they are uncorrelated, then what happens is that the economics change. In particular, the standard deviation goes down from 423.5% to about 35%. How many of you would invest in a fund that offered you an average rate of return of 12% for a 35% volatility? Yeah, we get a few more hands now. So we're getting more money here. But can we really raise $30 billion? The answer is, on the one hand, versus the other hand, it depends. It depends on various different parameters. But if we did have uncorrelated projects, 150 of them, it turns out that we can actually issue bonds to finance these projects. And if you tap into the bond markets, you get tremendous, tremendous resources. So let's just do the math about how we go about it. If you had 150 independently and identically distributed projects, each with a 5% probability of pay dirt, and if you succeed, you get $12.3 billion, the probability that out of 150 projects, you have at least 3 successes, you can actually calculate that. It's a simple binomial distribution. And that probability is 98.18%. You've got a 98% chance of getting at least 3 hits out of 150 trials if they're independent. And if we had 3 hits, that means that we would have 3 times $12.3 billion in year 10, which means you have $36 billion in year 10. And if you had $36 billion in year 10, you could issue bonds up to a face value of $36 billion without defaulting. And that would allow you, at current rates, to raise $29 billion today by issuing bonds with face value $36 billion. Now, I'm using an interest rate of 2.33% for these bonds. That's the rate that you would charge on AA rated bonds. How do I know that this is the right rate? Well, the historical default rate after 10 years of issuance of AA rated bonds is about 2%. And that default rate is exactly given by this probability, 1 minus 98.18%. So I'm actually being a little bit conservative here. I've got a lower default rate than the typical AA bond. And if we use all of the other tricks of the financial trade, like securitization, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, we can do even better than this. Now, some of you are smirking, thinking, gee, do we really want to do that? I mean, isn't that what gave us the financial crisis? But the point is that these methods figured prominently in the financial crisis, not because they didn't work. They figured it into the crisis because they worked way too well. They're incredibly powerful tools for raising large amounts of capital over short periods of time for specific purposes. So in the case of drug development, we start with a single compound, and maybe it goes to phase 1, maybe it fails, and then you have to sell it or withdraw it. But on occasion, it'll pass through phase 2 and phase 3, and eventually you get an approved drug, and that works out well. Now imagine if you did that for 150 of these things, some of which succeed, some of which get withdrawn, some of which get sold. What that does is it generates a sequence of cash flows. If you have a sequence of cash flows, you can securitize that, meaning you can issue bonds collateralized by the underlying assets, which are the molecules or other therapeutics. And over time, those cash flows will go to pay back the various different bondholders in different tranches. And eventually, you'll actually be able to make money if the underlying projects work out. So this is the basic idea that we've known for many years in the financial industry. And the one thing we learned from the financial crisis is that correlations matter. So the assumption that I made of IID, independently and identically distributed projects, that's a very important assumption. What if it changes? What if it's not independent? What if they're correlated? Well, let me show you. So this is a probability curve of producing at least K successes out of 150 trials. And let's let K be 3. So what's the probability of producing at least 3 successes out of 150 trials if each particular trial has a 5% chance of succeeding? Well, if they're IID, then I already told you that number is 98.18%. So that's the value up here for 0 correlation. What if the success or failure across compounds is correlated at a level of 10%? Well, then the probability goes down to about 90% for producing 3 or more successes. If the correlation is 40%, then we're talking about a less than 60% probability of at least 3 successes. And if the correlation is at 80%, you're now down here at 20%. At that point, nobody is going to want to buy your bonds because the probability of default is so high, it's not even in junk bond territory. Correlation matters. And so one of the lessons that financial economists have learned years ago, thanks to Harry Markowitz, a Chicago PhD, is that you should diversify and don't put all your eggs in one basket. I showed this to one of my pharma company friends, and he said, you know what, I've been telling my colleagues this for years, and we don't do this in pharma. You know, the way we behave in pharma is like my 3rd grade daughter's soccer team. And I said, what do you mean? And so he said, well, he coaches his 3rd grade daughter's soccer team, and this is what the kids look like when they're on the soccer field. They all gather around the ball. And he tells them, no, spread out. You don't want to go to where the ball is. Go to where the ball will be. You compare this to World Cup soccer, what a difference. And pharma companies aren't doing this now. There's a tremendous herd mentality. So one of the benefits of applying basic economic theory is that it tells you things that you otherwise might have overlooked. Now, I'm not to say that pharma companies don't understand the basic facts of diversification. There are reasons why they aren't diversified, but there are ways that we can use financial engineering to help them do a better job of diversification. So that's the basic idea, and as an economist, I can say the rest are just details. I don't care about them. But of course, there are a lot of details that need to be ironed out, and I'm no expert in biomedicine. I can't comment on them. But I've now spent enough time talking to other experts that I can tell you a little bit about what they say regarding these different challenges. So I'll talk briefly about each one of those in red, but there are a number of papers that we've written that focus on all of the other challenges. And the short answer is, I think that we can actually do this. I think that this is a realistic set of possibilities. So let me just go through very quickly some of the challenges that you might have come across in your own thinking. First, do we really have enough capital among investors to do this? I mean, $30 billion is a large amount of money. Do we really have $30 billion? Second, do we really need $30 billion? Third, isn't pharma already doing this? And finally, these therapies that we're developing, they're very expensive. Can we really afford these therapies? So let me deal with each of these very quickly. First of all, is there enough capital? Well, those of you who are in the financial industry, you know as well as I do, $30 billion is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. It seems like a very large number to those who are in the biomedical industry. It's nothing in the financial industry. How do I know that? Well, let me show you some numbers. In 2015, the size of the US bond market, just the US, $39.9 trillion. Trillion. $6.4 trillion was issued just in the year 2015. In fact, corporations issued $1.5 trillion of debt in 2015. Just 1 year. Corporations selling their bonds. Mortgage-related debt, $8.7 trillion outstanding, $1.7 trillion issued. Asset-backed securities, $1.3 trillion outstanding. Money market funds, $2.8 trillion. There's a lot of money out there. What about investors? Well, MIT in 2011 wanted to finance some of its operations, so they issued bonds as well. Their bonds were snapped up by investors. They couldn't get enough of them. But what's amazing about this bond issue is that it was 100-year bonds. MIT issued 100-year bonds, $750 million worth. And you know what the interest rate was? 5.623%. And it was oversubscribed. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever looked into university finances, but if you have, you know that it's a really crazy business model, right? I mean, a university's operating budget is really only 40% of it is covered by tuition. The other 60% of its operating budget comes from gifts, generosity, donors here. And yet investors couldn't get enough of these bonds. Other investors, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, it's a single fund managed by a handful of people, $873 billion of money that needs to be invested. The single state pension fund, California Public Employee Retirement System, $304 billion. And these funds, they're not looking for 20, 30, 50% rates of return, as some of the biotech VCs expect. They're looking for, in 2012, 8%, and now they've lowered that expectation to like 7.5%. And so the kind of rates of return are really right in line with the kinds of things that we can do in biomedicine with that $30 billion kind of a fund. In contrast to these numbers, let me show you a little bit about what the VC industry looks like. In 2015, if you take all of the venture capital funding in the entire United States across all of the different industries, you know how many $1 trillion that is? Well, it's actually not in the trillions, it's 165 billion. And of that 165 billion, do you know how much of that was invested in biotech in 2015? Just biotech. $7.6 billion. If you need $30 billion, you're not going to get it from the venture capital industry. It is way too big. Now, the numbers, 30 billion, I pulled that out of the air really because that's what you need to get diversification of a reasonable level to make it attractive in cancer. In other fields, it's different. But the fact is that these numbers, just based upon back-of-the-envelope calculations, show that the business model of venture capital is broken. Venture capital as an activity is very active, and there are a number of very successful venture capitalists out there. In Boston, we happen to be home to 3 or 4 of the most successful biotech VCs in the world, including Polaris, MPM, Flagship, Third Rock. But the venture capital business model doesn't work properly for biotech because it takes too long, it's too risky, and it requires too much money. You know, instead of investing $40 million in a chemical compound that'll take 12 years to pay off, you can invest $500,000 in an app company, and 2 years later it gets bought out for Facebook for $19 billion. It's a very different risk-reward profile. So second, do we really need $30 billion? And this is, again, the economist's answer. Well, it depends. It depends on a bunch of different things. On parameters. What's the cost of development per compound, the probability of success, duration of the trials, the correlation among the trials' profits, and so on and so forth. The short answer is we don't know whether or not you need 30 billion because it depends on all of these things. But my co-authors and I, when we first wrote our paper on this in 2012, we put our software on our website with an open source license for anybody to take it, modify it, steal it, give it away, and plug in your own assumptions and see whether or not this works for you. Because we need to collaborate between financial engineers and biomedical experts to be able to estimate these kinds of probabilities and calculate these risk-reward trade-offs. So my co-authors and I have been doing that over the course of the last few years. We've written a number of papers. And by the way, I should mention that most of you who are familiar with the economics literature, you'll never see any of these papers. We haven't published any of these in economics journals for a very simple reason. There's nothing new in these papers from an economic or finance perspective. And to an academic, admitting that there's nothing new in a paper is the height of heresy and embarrassment. But actually, in this case, this is a feature, not a bug. And the reason is that we're not doing anything really dramatically new, so the ideas can be implemented very readily. They're not threatening to anybody because they've been around literally for decades. These are not our ideas. So we applied this to a number of different settings. And in one particular setting I want to tell you about, it really surprised us dramatically. We applied this method to a portfolio of rare disease therapeutics. Now, a rare disease, according to the US Orphan Drug Act of 1983, is any disease that afflicts 200,000 patients or less. So things like muscular dystrophy or hemophilia, sickle cell anemia, Gaucher disease, these are examples of diseases that are relatively small in terms of patient population. Unfortunately, many of these small diseases happen to be deadly. They don't just simply cause pain and suffering. You die from them after a certain number of years. And we actually looked at a portfolio of rare disease therapeutics that have been developed by a part of NIH, the National Institutes of Health, called NCATS. NCATS stands for the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. This is a part of NIH that focuses on helping scientists take their basic research for rare diseases and translate them into projects that venture capitalists can then take all the way to completion. So it's really meant to sort of accelerate that process. We took a look at 38 of their projects, and we evaluated the economic value by getting venture capitalists to tell us what they think this is worth, how much they would pay for it. We looked at the probability of success based upon the literature for rare disease therapeutics, and we simulated a fund that had these 38 projects in the portfolio securitized by senior debt, junior debt, and an equity tranche. And our simulation showed that the equity tranche earned a rate of return of about 22%, which astonished us. I mean, this rate of return is better than most hedge funds during that time period. And so the other thing that shocked us was that you don't need $30 billion for these projects. In fact, you couldn't use $30 billion because we're talking about small patient populations. So the clinical trials don't cost $200 million. It's more like $15 or $20 million. And so for a portfolio size of around $500 million, $500 million, you can actually earn rates of return on the order of 22%. So the question that you might want to ask is, how would that work in terms of the economics, though? Because you got to make sure that the assumptions hold. Well, the correlation curves that I showed you before, where you don't necessarily have IID for cancer drugs, it turns out that for rare disease therapeutics, the IID assumption holds almost by definition, because the cause of many of these rare diseases is a genetic mutation, which is pretty much random. And so whether or not you can develop a therapy for a rare disease is almost by construction independently and identically distributed. And so if you've got 20 projects with the probability of success of 5% and their IID, the probability of at least 3 hits is minuscule, 10%. But because rare diseases are relatively easier to be able to find therapies for, typically it causes a missing enzyme, so you can replace the enzyme. If you can increase the probability of success to, say, 30%, which is what it is for rare diseases, you're back to that 98% probability of at least 3 hits. And now the question, can you make money off of this? Well, that was the first question that I had. If these are rare diseases, then maybe you really can't make money off of it. Well, here are a variety of examples of rare disease drugs. And every single one of these drugs is a blockbuster in terms of generating more than $1 billion a year in sales. Now, you might recognize one of the drugs there, Herceptin. I mentioned that earlier. That's a breast cancer drug. Breast cancer is not a rare disease. 230,000 women get diagnosed with breast cancer every year. 30,000 women die of breast cancer every year. How is that a rare disease? Well, this is where the magic of genetic screening comes in. Because we've been able to sequence the human genome, we can stratify patient populations by their genes. And what we find is that people with certain mutations respond beautifully to Herceptin, but those with other mutations, they won't respond at all. And we know that in advance now. So it's terrific. We can actually target patient populations that happen to be under 200,000, so it qualifies for rare disease status. And there's accelerated approval and other benefits for it. I call it divide and conquer. That's the strategy. From a purely biological perspective, it makes sense. But from a financial perspective, it makes even more sense. In fact, I try to describe to my economics colleagues why it is that rare diseases are so important to study from an analytical, financial perspective. And the way that I describe it is that you can think of rare diseases as the Arrow-Debreu securities of biology. That means nothing to you if you're not an economics geek. But to an economist, it sort of immediately makes sense that you want to take the entire patient population, divide them up into basic building blocks, and then figure out how to finance those building blocks separately. And incidentally, I want to mention that Keytruda, the drug that saved Jimmy Carter's life, that's a rare disease drug, and it was only approved in 2014. So he was an enormously fortunate individual in getting the disease when he did, because he was able to benefit from it. So a couple of other points that I'll mention, and I'm going to wrap up. Isn't pharma already doing this? And the answer is, well, sort of, yes and no. Pharma used to be doing this. In fact, if you take a look at Pfizer as an example, Pfizer has a balance sheet of about $34 billion in cash. And that $34 billion is largely financed by long-term debt, $32.8 billion. So when you look at Pfizer, it looks an awful lot like that $30 billion mega fund that I described before. The problem is that Pfizer is not using the cash to fund these kinds of early-stage risky projects. Remember the Pfizer volatility of their stock price? They're trying to lower their volatility. And so the way they're doing that is by saving their money and spending it on acquiring other companies after the risk has been taken out. So they were about to acquire Allergan, and of course we know that was sort of put out by US Treasury, did not go through, right? And the reason that Pfizer's doing it is because us shareholders, we're telling Pfizer to do this. And the way we're doing it is through their stock analyst reports that encourage the pharma industry to get out of the R&D business and to focus instead on the marketing and distribution business. So in 2010, Morgan Stanley produced a very influential research report for the pharma industry titled Exit Research and Create Value. That's a pretty insulting title. If I were in the pharma industry, I'd be insulted. And let me tell you what they say in the report. The report states, the solution, our economic value added analysis, supports replacing research with search. On current market economics, we estimate that $1 invested in in-licensed compounds will on average deliver 3 times as much value as $1 invested in in-house research. Traditionally, that was done by venture capitalists, but venture capitalists now are moving into less risky things. Everybody wants that black curve. Nobody wants that blue curve because we like reward, we don't like risk. And so pharma has been listening to that advice. Between 2008 and 2013, the pharma industry cut about 150,000 jobs, the vast majority of which are in R&D, not in marketing and distribution. In fact, this has hit Massachusetts pretty close to home. Biogen, they just fired last year 800 people. Why? Because they wanted to keep the Tecfidera sales engine running. So they thought that it was more important to have marketing people to sell their drug rather than to have researchers produce new drugs. And you know what? When they did that, their stock price went up. Congratulations. You did what we told you to do, and we like that, and so we're going to reward you for it. Meanwhile, and that's why the pharma industry has been actually improving after that lost decade. They listen, they cut costs, reduced R&D, and that has left a gap in funding. So the last thing I want to tell you about, and then wrap up, is can we afford these therapies? Because these cures that are being developed, they're expensive. And as an economist, I get it, because price is not the only thing that matters. In fact, for a brief period, this individual was the most hated man in America. In fact, maybe he still is. This is the CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals, Martin Shkreli, who raised the price of certain generic drugs by 5,000%. Right. And so the first point I want to make is that there is a big difference between price gouging, which is not acceptable in any industry, versus pricing really expensive breakthrough therapies. And let me give you an example of that distinction. Hepatitis C is an infectious disease that I think most of you are familiar with. If you have it, it doesn't necessarily harm you right away, but eventually it will cause all sorts of problems, including liver damage that will eventually lead to either death or a liver transplant. A few years ago, a company called Gilead Sciences developed a cure for hepatitis C, a cure called Sovaldi. 12 weeks of pills, and you are done with the disease once and for all. What would you pay for this drug? Now, before you answer, let me tell you that the cost of a liver transplant in 2011 was over $500,000. And it's an infectious disease, so there's a public health issue with the disease spreading to various people. And if you think about the saving of a life with this set of pills, the US government has established that the value of a statistical life is $9.1 million. In fact, I believe that Professor Becker was one of the individuals that pioneered the calculation of these kinds of statistics. Very important for policy making. $9.1 million, if somebody gets the drug after a third of his life is gone, you're saving 2/3 of a life. That's $6 million of savings when you save a life. So with those numbers in mind, what would you pay for this drug if you had hepatitis C? Or if your son or daughter or father or mother had hepatitis, what would you pay for the drug? What would you think would be a reasonable price? Some people would say, I'll pay anything for it. But realistically, what do you think? $1 million? $500,000? $250,000? Well, the price of Sovaldi is $84,000. That's just the sticker price. We give discounts. $84,000. When I first looked at this number, I was amazed. I thought, wow, what a fantastic bargain. That's a great deal. But when this drug was first introduced on the market, tremendous backlash. There was congressional hearings. The CEO of Gilead was dragged in front of Congress and berated for being, heartless capitalists. And I couldn't understand why. Well, it's because 3 million US patients have hepatitis C. If we want to give everybody the treatment, that would cost a little bit more than $250 billion right now. That's a big hit. And much of that hit goes on to state bottom lines because of Medicare and Medicaid. The issue is not whether this is worth it. The issue is how do we afford it? It's a big expense. And so we know how to deal with that, right? When you think about major purchases in your life, the way we deal with it is we take out a loan. So why not create mortgages for healthcare? In particular, in Finance 101, we teach our students how to convert an upfront payment into a series of even payments over a period of time. Basic mortgage formula. If you apply this to Sovaldi, over a 10-year horizon, if you make monthly payments that are level payments at a 3% rate of interest, $811 per month. That's like a car payment. And 3% may be a relatively low figure. Maybe for consumers, it's going to be 10%. But even at 10%, at $1,100 a month, that's expensive, but it's affordable for many people. Not for everybody, but it's certainly more affordable than paying $84,000 up front. So if you think about taking consumer loans for healthcare and you apply all of the tricks of the financial trade to that, it turns out that you can increase patient access to these therapies using finance. So in a paper that we published just about 3 months ago in Science Translational Medicine, we ran a simple simulation where we assumed that you had a bunch of patients that were taking out loans for this very expensive therapy, and they were amortizing over a 9-year horizon, kind of like a student loan. And we looked at the default rates of student loans, as well as the mortality rates of individuals that have hepatitis C. We factored all of that in and ran a simulation, and what we found was that in terms of the rates of return for debt structured in this manner, it actually looks pretty attractive, especially given where current rates are and opportunities for investing. So this seems like finance is perfectly poised to be able to do something of significance, both for society as well as for investors. And that's what we've been working on over the course of the last few years. And a number of individuals in the industry have now stepped up to explore this with us. And so over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, we're actually thinking that some of these ideas could actually be put into practice. We don't know yet, but we certainly have some very important partners that are working with us on it. Yeah. So in other words, it may mean that there are multiple funds that will be needed in order to deal with all of these different challenges, absolutely. And it's not to say that everybody can afford all of the different therapies that will be available to them. But that's true now with all sorts of consumer products. You know, when Sovaldi came out, that was just about the time that Tesla introduced their Model S car. And oddly enough, the Model S Tesla that I was lusting after was about $84,000. And so I was wondering, why wasn't there this big congressional uproar about Tesla being priced at $84,000? I mean, they should lower their price too. And the reason is, of course, because if you don't buy a Tesla, you won't die. You don't need a Tesla to live, despite what I tell my wife. So that suggests that there's actually an ethical dilemma here. And the ethical dilemma is one of the reasons why plain economics really aren't enough and why economists can't work in isolation. One of the articles that I read right around the same time as this was going on was an article by 2 oncologists who wrote an op-ed piece saying that they thought it was outrageous how cancer drugs were priced. And they just really felt that we needed a different approach. And the last sentence of that article was, we believe that there has to be a rational approach to pricing these drugs, as opposed to the current practice of pricing what the market will bear. Now, as an economist, I have to tell you that I had to read that sentence twice. Because to me, that is a rational approach, charging what the market will bear. Doctors don't think in those terms. People don't think in those terms. It's what makes economists special, but it also is what makes economists somewhat removed from some of the debate that needs to happen. So I'll get to your question in just a minute. Let me just wrap up. The last thing I want to say about where we're going with all of this is, can these tools really be used? I think they can, and I think they can because there's a huge amount of motivation in society to do that. And I want to leave you with one particular story that really struck me and convinced me that we can do this. And the story has to do with the fact that, we can declare war on cancer, but we may not be winning the war, and it's because that's the wrong metaphor. War is based on fear and hate, and you can't be fearful and hate for very long. Greed, on the other hand, is very sustainable. And so if you can put a price tag on cancer's head, you can actually do well by doing good. Finance doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And the story that really highlights that has to do with this fellow, who's a colleague of mine at MIT. He's a biologist by the name of Harvey Loutish, a cell biologist at the famed MIT Whitehead Institute. Harvey's story is amazing. When I first heard it, I decided right then and there, I want to be Harvey Loutish. And the reason is because in 1983, Harvey was approached by a venture capitalist to help him with a particular project focused on a rare disease called Gaucher syndrome. Gaucher's is a genetic mutation that causes causes your body to not be able to produce a certain kind of an enzyme for processing fatty substances. And without that enzyme, the fatty substances start building up in your liver, your spleen, and eventually you die from that illness. It only affects about 1 in 20,000 patients in the US, so it's a rare disease. But for those who have it, in the 1980s, it was pretty much a death sentence. So Harvey, because of his knowledge of cell biology, and in particular surface protein chemical reactions, was able to figure out a way to replicate this missing enzyme. And in 1991, the drug Ceridase was approved. And that and many other variants since then have been a godsend to these Gaucher patients. They now can live a normal life, albeit as a chronic manageable condition. It's not a cure, but it allows them to live a natural life. And you might have heard of Harvey's company. It's called Genzyme. And in 2012, it was acquired by Sanofi for about $20 billion. Now, that's not why I want to be Harvey Loutish. I want to be Harvey because of what happened in 2002. In 2002, Harvey's daughter became pregnant with her first child, Harvey and his wife's first grandchild, a son named Andrew. And when Andrew was conceived and in utero, they diagnosed him with Gaucher disease. Now, just because you have the mutation, it doesn't mean you'll get the disease full-blown. You have to wait till you reach puberty. But in 2012, when Andrew turned 10, he did develop the symptoms. But he's doing just fine, thank you very much, because of Grandpa's drug. So you can imagine that Harvey's a pretty popular guy in that household. When he was doing his work, he had no idea that he would one day save the life of his grandson. And so when I heard the story, I thought, what are the chances? I want to be Harvey Loutish. I'd love to be able to do that, but I can't. I'm not a cell biologist. I don't know anything about biomedicine. I've never saved a life. But we can all be Harvey Loutish if we invest in a fund that someday cures the illnesses of our grandchildren. And that's the pitch. That's the vision. We can all do this if we find the right financial structure. And so I think economists do play a role. And thanks to the Becker Friedman Institute and all of the great work that comes out of the University of Chicago, including real healthcare economists like Tom Phillipson, who's sitting in the back, I think that we actually can have a real impact on all of these diseases. Thank you.
If there are multiple funds, and say for instance, I think your number was 3, so if another fund comes up with another drug that approaches cancer in the same way, does your risk tolerance change in that way?
Absolutely. I think all things change. Not only do those parameters change, but also the pricing could change. As you get more funding, you're going to get the ability to be able to pay more for drugs. So prices could actually have the perverse effect of going up because of all of these funds coming up. But ultimately, I think that what the market will bear is what the appropriate outcome will be. I still believe that markets actually work pretty well and that we ought to let them work as freely as we can, but with an eye towards understanding what the ethical implications are, because now you're dealing with life and death questions, and ethics are unavoidable. Yes?
It seems like your thesis, I know a little bit about pharma, that the reason that they're all bunched is because it's just horrible economic to develop these drugs, and the chance of getting 150 uncorrelated is like virtually nil. Mm-hmm. But I'm really excited. So if you could talk about to connect your two assertions, the uncorrelated part, and sub-segmenting diseases, because that, it seems, that's dependent. One is dependent on the other.
Absolutely, yes. So when we simulated our cancer mega fund, we actually didn't use uncorrelatedness as the assumption. We looked at single cancer companies, so publicly traded companies in the biomedical field that focused on cancer, anti-cancer agents, and we calculated the correlations of their stock prices, and we got a number like 30%. So we used 30% for the pairwise correlations. But to your point, the correlations could actually be higher than that, and you would expect that if you take a look at angiogenesis compounds, if one anti-angiogenesis compound fails, most likely that will have some impact on the other compounds. So I think that you have to manage the correlations. But we do this all the time. I mean, we do this now in finance. For example, Microsoft and Google are not uncorrelated. And yet we include them in the same portfolio, and we're happy to have an index of 500 stocks who are mostly highly correlated. So as long as you provide proper disclosure, and as long as you get the right investors with the right risk profile who want to take that risk, correlation is not a problem. The key is managing those correlations and acknowledging them explicitly. So I think that's one point. Second point that you mentioned about the uncorrelatedness when you stratify patient populations, to me, that's the much more, and to you as well, that's the much more exciting prospect. So that's why the paper I'm working on now called Divide and Conquer, where we're actually looking at this not as a biological strategy, but as a financial strategy. It seems with breast cancer, lung cancer, diabetes, all sorts of diseases, we are now stratifying patients by their genetic makeup. And what we're finding is that drugs actually target these subpopulations. So we're actually doing clinical trials in a very different way. The very famous I Spy breast cancer trial, we're writing a case study on them. They actually show that you can do these diagnostics along the way on the clinical trial. So by the time you get to phase 3, you already know what patient populations to target. That dramatically reduces the number of patients you need for those clinical trials, reducing the cost, reducing the side effects, and so on and so forth. So I think that's an area where precision medicine, which is the buzzword that's used, is working hand in hand with precision financing or adaptive financing to be able to reduce the cost. So I'm hopeful that the $200 million figure, or the $2.6 billion for a successful drug, that number will come down now because of the magic of stratification.
Asymmetric information in identifying the 150 and like a lemons issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is I have no idea. That's a question for biomedical experts. But let me tell you what they would say if I were channeling them. So there are two things. One is that you obviously need to have smart people picking projects and, more importantly, killing projects. And there are a number of people, not a huge number, but there is more than one talented drug picker that has had a track record of being able to identify good projects and killing bad projects. Those are the ones that you want to have managing your portfolio. But even if you don't have those people, what I would argue is that you might want to think about the financial analogy of an index fund. If you're Warren Buffett, hats off to you, you're going to be very wealthy. Or if you know that you're going to be investing with a Warren Buffett. But if you don't, maybe you just want to put your money in the S&P 500. And so if you think about diversifying across a large number of projects, if it's well diversified enough, you may not have to pick. It may not be as important. There's alpha and there's beta from the financial perspective. And you can get rewarded for one or the other or both. So that's how I would approach it as a finance person. Get the very best talent you can, but if you can't, get a bigger diversified portfolio.
Is there potentially negative alpha if there's one person that's really good at getting all of the things? That would be more concern, right?
That's right, it could be. And I've actually asked that question, and in the area of cancer, which is the area that I've studied the most, I've heard a number of people say that you never know where the next breakthrough is going to come. It's too complicated. Nobody has a lock on all the good ideas. And if they did, they'd probably be in Massachusetts. But sorry, I'm partial. But even somebody from MIT would acknowledge that not all the great ideas in biomedicine come out of MIT. We've got a lot of great ideas. We've got Bob Langer, Eric Lander, and so on and so forth. But it's a really hard subject. And the way that I actually got a little bit of an intuition about this is take a look at who files the largest number of biomedical patents. So just take a look out there at the universities that file these patents. Who do you think files the largest number of life sciences patents in the United States among the universities? MIT? No. Nope. Close. UC Berkeley, UC system, number one.
Not UC San Francisco?
That's part of the UC system.
Yeah, okay.
They're in there. The UC system, number one.
Yeah.
Hopkins is up there, but Hopkins, I think, is maybe number 3 or number 4. Number 2 is University of Michigan. Really? I did not know that. But
Wow.
it's a huge school, lots of researchers, lots of intellectual property. So nobody has a lock on all the best ideas. That's why you need a well-diversified fund. Yes.
You mentioned this professor at MIT, Professor Loutish, who's been your idol in a way, and you have been working with hedge funds. So do I see a hedge fund coming up at 500 million or so, utilizing some of the techniques you talked about?
You know what? If I had an MD, PhD, I would do this tomorrow. But I don't. And so what I've been doing is introducing the idea to other people who do have MD, PhDs and introducing them to people who have the money. I see a really crazy situation here. From my perspective, I see a ton of money, trillions of dollars, looking for a home and not earning a reasonable rate of return right now because the opportunities are few and far between. And on the other side, I see tremendous talent in the biomedical field, being at MIT, with all of the hospitals, all of the universities, all of the incredible talented researchers and grad students. They're struggling. Many of them are leaving the field because they can't get grants. Do you know what the average age of the first NIH grant is? When you get your first NIH grant, what do you think that is? What's the average age? 42. Used to be 40. It's now 42. How do you make a living? How do you have a family when you don't have your first grant until you're in your 40s? So you know what? They're leaving. They're leaving the industry. They're coming into my MBA class looking for jobs in finance because they can't follow their dream of curing cancer. And they're working for all of us. So I see a stupid situation where we've got the money, we've got the talent, we don't have a pipe that puts the two together. And that's what I'm hoping economists can contribute to the debate. We can find the pipes. Some. It's actually very surprising. The Defense Department actually spends $1.5 billion a year on cancer research. Why, you might ask? Well, the VA system has a lot of patients, many of whom have cancer. And so yes, the Defense Department does. In fact, you probably didn't know, I didn't know this, the Human Genome Project didn't start out funded by NIH. You know how it got started? It was funded by the Energy Department and the Defense Department because they were concerned about the effects of radiation on genetic mutations. At least that's what they said. And so, yes, they do fund it, but not nearly enough. We really need to have much, much larger pools of capital to defease the risks. And I think that government funding plays an important role in funding basic science because there is no rate of return. You can't get an economic rate of return even though the rates of return are huge in terms of follow-on commercialization.